In 1534, the Act of Supremacy was passed, making Henry VIII the head of the Church of England. And with his trusted advisers, including Thomas Cromwell, he set about dissolving the monasteries and taking the lands for himself and his friends, including the one operated at Newland near Normanton by the Knights Hospitallers. The process of dissolution was aided by Richard Rich, a slippery character who rose to prominence as the King's solicitor and later the Lord Chancellor, who gave damning evidence at the trial of Thomas More, who in turn said Richard Rich was always reputedly light of his tongue, a great dicer and gamester, and not of any commendable fame. Nonetheless, the monasteries continued to fall, and Richard Rich, under the King's patronage, continued to rise in stature and wealth. How was the dissolution received by people here in the north? The 625 monastic foundations owned a quarter of all English land, but proportionally more here in the rural north, including the third richest Knights Hospitaller preceptory in England at Newland near Normanton. Yorkshire folk soon worked out that if monastic lands were sold by Henry VIII to his friends, the benefits wouldn't go to local people, but to the rich in the south. So money and work in Yorkshire would quickly drain southwards, and they would face greater poverty, especially with the King raising taxes. They were not against the King as such, but they were against the policy of taking the monastic land away from their local economy. A 1535 revolt in Lincolnshire sparked flame here in Yorkshire, and 40,000 armed men rose in revolt, not against the King, but against the King's advisers, who were blamed for deceiving the King into dissolving the monasteries to force him to restore the monasteries' lands and money. They marched through major towns, gaining support as they went. This was the Pilgrimage of Grace. Rebel leader Robert Aske said, "Within short space of years, there would be no money or treasure in these parts." Here at Wakefield, on the 12th of October, the King's commissioners appointed to assess the latest tax dare not sit in the town. York opened its gates to the rebels. At Pontefract Castle they framed their demands, but at Scoresby Lees, Doncaster, the Earl of Norfolk, sent by the King, promised pardons and a parliament in the north to stop the rebels before they could get any further. Aske's rebels, believing the King misled by evil commoners as his advisers, went home. Later, angered by further uprisings across the north, a worried Henry denied he'd ever given the Earl of Norfolk permission to pardon, and from May 1537 onwards, some 216 rebels were executed, including Lord Darcy, who had opened York's gates to the rebels. The property of those executed was forfeit to the King, and the suppression of the monasteries continued. What of Wakefield? The Westgate Bar, here imagined by Peter Breers, symbolises Wakefield as a divided city. The vast manor of Wakefield saw what happened to noble rebels like Lord Darcy. It depended strongly on supporting the Crown. It stayed loyal. But as the lands and money continued to drain from the local economy and taxes increased, the economic effects were being felt across all classes. Local wool merchants like Thomas Tattersall and gentry like William Lay of nearby Middleton faced declining income and raising taxes. Local priests cast out of their chantries like Wakefield's Chapel on the Bridge, or chantries in Pontefract and Wakefield's parish churches, men like William Swindon, John Grice or John Dixon were dispossessed. This mixture of victims made ideal co-conspirators, and Wakefield was thus very much a divided community. By 1540, even those who had stayed loyal to Henry during the Pilgrimage of Grace were thinking again. Wakefield began to conspire for itself. The Wakefield conspirators' plan was to gather with their followers at Pontefract Fair, neutralise the Council of the North by killing Robert Holgate, the King's man in the north, seize Pontefract Castle, the key to the north, and raise the standard of rebellion, seeking Scottish help. But they were betrayed, and with Henry already in a foul mood, punishment followed swiftly. Of the 31 plotters, which included 4 women and 11 priests, 1 a prior, and 3 each from Wakefield and Pontefract, 2 from Rothwell, 21 lay people. 26 were tried and no fewer than 15 were executed, 4 at Tyburn, but mostly at York, including the Wakefield priests William Swindon, John Grice and John Dixon. The King was now well and truly on his guard. He needed to make his presence felt in person and make royal progress, where his loyal subjects could pay him homage. Henry's progress to the north of June 1541 was the largest of any Tudor monarch. At 5,000 people, including many armed men, the retinue was almost 4 times the size of Wakefield. The purpose of Henry's progress was to receive the submission of the gentry of the north, quite literally on bended knee, with written commitments of loyalty and expensive gifts to the king to prove their loyalty after the events of the past few years. But just how insecure he felt about Wakefield is shown by his last-minute change of route. Originally, the king planned to enter Yorkshire via Sheffield, Monkbretton, Cheviot, Wakefield and Hazelwood, then to York. But he decided to avoid the West Riding almost entirely, entering via Barnsdale and Pontefract and spending time hunting at Hatfield and at Hull. Probably a very wise diversion, in which the Wakefield conspiracy no doubt played its part. A curious manuscript document in the John Godchild collection at Wakefield History Centre, reproduced in a printed booklet from the 1790s, which is held at Wakefield Library, tells the story of a battle at Newland near Wakefield in 1541 between the men of Wakefield, loyal to the king, led by Sir Richard Rich, who were called upon to march to Newland, the preceptory of the Knights Hospitallers, and there fought a battle to overcome the resistance of the knights to being evicted. Could this be a lost battle associated with the Wakefield conspiracy? The document, written by an author known only as P.W., describes it in detail and firmly anchors the battle to Lammastide, August and September in 1541, by reference to Henry's wife being Catherine Howard, whom he had wed in 1540, which was also the year the Knights Hospitallers were abolished by order of Parliament. The ballad references Sir Richard Rich as responsible for seizing the estate, and he was indeed in charge of the Court of Augmentations which did that, and to the men of Wakefield being on the side of the king, and as we've seen, many of them were, although the town was very much divided. Could the story in this ballad be true? Maybe, maybe not. The ballad refers to obviously joke names for the knights at Newland, Sir Claret Vine and Sir Vineyard Port, and describes Newland as a large castle with gilded turrets, which it wasn't. The whole language of the ballad is flowery and elaborate even for a medieval document. John Godchild, the owner of the manuscript himself, thought that the likely author was Benjamin Clarkson of Balverthorpe Hall in the 1790s. But why make it all up and pretend it was real?